business executives, expected future profits or cash flow, and changes in technology. I've shortened the list here from what we did in the long-term sense because most of the other variables that we included before in our saving and investment make more of a difference in the longer run than they do in the short run. Again, what this tells us, though, is that these three variables, because they're not explicitly in the equation, are also relatively minor in terms of their impact on investment itself. Now, financial frictions. This little hiccup or spasm, what we call F bar here. Now, F bar is what we refer to as a credit spread. A credit spread. Sometimes also referred to as a risk spread or a risk premium, or a default premium or default spread. What this recognizes is that there can be a difference in the relationship between the interest rate that businesses actually borrow at and what the Federal Reserve or the central bank sets short-term interest rates to be. So that difference can change. So here you can see that financial frictions are simply the interest rate that businesses borrow at, R sub I, right, the interest rate for investment purposes, minus the interest rate that the central bank sets. Now, there are a couple of other ways that we could look at this. Right? The interest rate that businesses borrow at is also equal to the interest rate that the central bank sets, plus any financial frictions that may be there. And the second notation here, central bank short-term interest rate plus financial frictions, is what we've put into our equation back here. We'll see later that the reason we do that is we want to be very explicit about what's happening to the real interest rate that the central bank sets and pay explicit attention to whatever these financial frictions might be. Now, this is a chart that we could think of as being financial frictions. Now, if you look at this, what you would see is at least since the 70s, the average looks to be about 2 percentage points. That is whatever, and unfortunately I didn't do the central bank rate, I did the Treasury 10-year rate, but close enough for what we want to see here, that the risky rate that businesses pay is on average 2 percentage points higher than what the U.S. Treasury would borrow money at. Most businesses are riskier than the U.S. government, and therefore investors demand a higher rate of return to compensate them for that additional risk. 2 percentage points is what it works out to be on average. However, you can also see that during the Great Recession, we're not sure we want to lend. We're really not sure that we want to lend to you at 2% premium, or even a 3, or a 4, or a 5. We want a 6 percentage point premium. This is huge. As you can see in this chart, by far and away the biggest increase in the highest level that we've ever seen, which tells us that the financial frictions, the disruptions in the financial markets were quite severe. Now, one other thing to note about this particular chart, in every recession, financial frictions increase. So if we think about what financial frictions are telling us, this shouldn't be terribly surprising. If we think of the credit spread as a risk premium, as the economy goes into a recession, economic activity is falling, incomes are falling, which means that corporate profits are falling. And in fact, corporate profits fall much faster than real GDP does during a recession. So any level of corporate debt now needs to be supported by a smaller profit level or cash flow level, increasing the financial pressure on companies. That increased pressure means that the probability that more companies will default, not make payments on their loans, has increased. The market perceives whatever that additional risk is and now decides to charge a premium. So these are going to be our financial frictions, and as you see, they have an effect on investment, fixed investment in our model. Okay. Now, net exports. Net exports, of course, are simply our exports, what we produce but sell to foreigners, minus our imports, what we buy but was produced by foreigners. Now, this is another big change that I'm introducing, and slightly different than maybe a lot different than what's in your textbook, both the first and the second edition. But this is going to make our lives much easier because it opens up for like 1,500 new kinds of problem set and exam questions. No, I'm just joking. Okay, so now a little bit of this equation is actually in a footnote in the second edition. It may be in the first edition too, I don't know. But the textbook actually uses this really bizarre, very, very simple net export equation where they say simply the net exports equals autonomous net exports minus some function of the real interest rate. Drives me nuts. So we're not going to do that anymore. So this is the equation that we're going to use. So a couple of things to notice. Net exports still are a function of autonomous net exports, right here. They also depends upon foreign economic activity. Foreign economic activity. If the economy and our major trading partners is rising, they will be spending more money. Some of what they buy will be, for them, imports, and for us will be exports. So if economic activity is rising in, say, Canada, Mexico, and China, our largest 3 trading partners, then we would expect they would be buying more U.S.-made goods, and our exports would go up. So exports would increase the net export balance. So we have a plus sign. And X is just, for exports, by the way, is the parameter that tells us how sensitive net exports are to changes in foreign economic activity. It's also true that, as we saw on last Thursday, that the import side of the equation is strongly connected to domestic real economic activity. If our economy is booming, chances are we're also buying more imports along with everything else. More imports, of course, reduces net exports. So we've got a minus sign. And this little m just tells us the sensitivity of net exports to domestic economic activity, sometimes referred to as the marginal propensity to import. And then where Michigan talks about the real interest rate, we're going to introduce instead the real exchange rate. Now we'll see later that movements in the real interest rate and the real exchange rate are highly correlated. So there's nothing wrong with what Michigan did in terms of using the real interest rate here. It's just that later we're going to want to think about how the real interest rate and the real exchange rate are related, and it helps us if we can break that out now. So I've done so. So here again, what you can see, we've got a minus sign. If the real exchange rate rises, it makes American products more expensive to the rest of the world. They buy fewer of them, exports go down. Net exports go down. If the real exchange rate increases, it means that foreign-made products are cheaper for Americans, and we buy more of them. So imports go up, and net exports go down. Now, if you don't understand the relationship between exchange rates and the prices of imported and exported goods, don't worry about it at this stage. We'll look at it in much more detail later in the semester. Just remember it's an inverse relationship. Now, with that in mind, we can look again at some of the variables that are in autonomous net exports. So we have things like, what is the domestic preference for foreign-made products? If we have an increase in our desire for foreign-made products, imports will go up, exports will go, net exports will go down. We have a minus sign. If foreign preferences for domestic-made products goes up, our exports would rise, and net exports would increase, a plus sign. And if foreign countries increase their trade barriers, it'll be harder to export, and net exports will go down. So just to give you an example, in the mid-1970s, and I realize this is an ancient example, but in the mid-1970s, when OPEC decided to quintuple the price of oil, American consumers all of a sudden had this tremendous desire for small fuel-efficient automobiles from Japan and Germany, because American automakers didn't make any small fuel-efficient automobiles. And what we immediately saw was imports of cars from Europe and Japan increased significantly, and the net export balance deteriorated. So we could see a different thing here if we all of a sudden decide American companies come up with something that foreigners would like. So when Apple introduced the iPhone, the iPad, the iWatch, the this, the that, all of a sudden what do we see? Foreigners want these products too. So American exports go up. Net exports also improve. So preferences can make a difference here in terms of what happens to net exports. So again, just keep in mind that foreign real economic activity should be positively related to net exports, while domestic real economic activity should be negatively related. For now, we are going to treat the real exchange rate as an exogenous variable. That will change later, but for now, we're going to treat it as an exogenous variable. Now, we need a government purchases function. And here, we're going to be real simple, since I've given you a complicated function already. We'll make this one really, really simple. And we'll simply say that government purchases, planned government purchases, are an autonomous variable. That they are simply decided by a political process, and that the government actually spends exactly what it plans to spend. Now, this may seem like a really, really simplifying assumption, and not very realistic. But the fact of the matter is, generations of econ PhD students have been looking for a relationship between government purchases and other macroeconomic variables for at least 50 years. Definitely 40 years, because I looked at it when I was in graduate school, and it's been a while. So what we found is that there is no statistically significant, consistent relationship between real government purchases and other macroeconomic variables. So we've done the only prudent thing, and that is we've given up. We're not going to look anymore, right? After 50 years of looking, can't find anything. At some point, you just decide we'll treat government purchases as an exogenous variable. Now that brings us to the tax function, which again is going to be different from what's in your book. In the second edition, this is down in a footnote. Again, this makes it much, much more realistic in things that we'll be looking at over the next couple of weeks. So our tax function, or tax revenues, is basically going to have, again, an autonomous portion. That's the fixed portion that's determined by the government. And then it's also going to have a tax rate times the level of income. So what this latter component recognizes is that in most countries, most of the time, we actually have income taxes, right? Income taxes. That's all that's suggesting. So little t here is just the average marginal tax rate. Okay, so there's our four expenditure functions: consumption function, planned investment function, government purchases function, net export function, and because we have disposable income in our consumption function, we also need to have a tax function. So now we can go back to planned expenditures and actual expenditures. Remember, we're talking about equilibrium. So actual expenditures or actual output has to equal planned expenditures. Well, that simply means that in equilibrium, actual economic output is going to equal planned consumption plus planned investment plus planned government plus planned net exports. Now, this is simply an identity for what equilibrium is. But we just wrote down expressions, functions, for all of these expenditure components. So why don't we put them in? So we have economic output equals our consumption function plus our investment function plus our government purchases function plus our net export function. Okay, so that's all we've done there. Now, we also recognize that what we want to do is solve for economic output. But we have economic output on both the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So assuming you can all do some basic algebra, you should be able to solve this equation for economic output. And when you do, you will see this. You will then close your eyes, throw your hands up in the air, and shriek loudly. Ah! Right? Because this is a really, really messy equation. Now, notice, though, that we could break this equation into three parts. Okay? So we have these three different components to this equation on the right-hand side of this equation. Now, the first thing to notice, in each of these three components, the denominator is exactly the same. 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times 1 minus the tax rate plus the marginal propensity to import. Okay? And that's in all three situations. So what makes these three components different is not the denominator. It's what's in the numerator. So let's look at the top component. If you look at everything that's in the numerator, what do you see? There's a bar over the top of everything. So what we've done in that first component is collected all of the autonomous variables. We've collected all of the autonomous variables, and we put them in that first expression. So it's all the autonomous consumption or spending components. It's autonomous financial frictions, and it's autonomous taxes and foreign economic output. Okay? Now, the second component in the numerator is simply our real exchange rate and the sensitivity of economic output to changes in the real exchange rate. Now, remember, for now, we're going to leave the real exchange rate as an exogenous variable. We will relax that later, but we'll leave this as an exogenous variable. So, by and large, this variable is not going to change. And over here in our third expression, we have our real interest rate. And it's multiplied by C plus D, which is the interest rate sensitivity of consumption and investment. Those two variables simply tell us how sensitive is consumer spending and in planned investment spending to changes in the real interest rate. The more sensitive, the bigger the numbers. The less sensitive, the smaller the values of C and D. And again, notice we've got a minus sign. So increases in the real interest rate raise the cost of borrowing. There'll be less borrowing. If there's less borrowing, there'll be less spending. Less spending means less economic output. So that's what our basic three variables look like. Now, there's one other thing that I want to point out about this. For reasonable values of the marginal propensity to consume, the tax rate, little t, and the marginal propensity to import, little m, the denominator here will be less than 1. Less than 1. Why is that important? Well, think about a ratio. Think about any ratio. If the denominator is less than 1, the value of the ratio is greater than the value of the numerator. Right? If the denominator is less than 1, then the value of the ratio is greater than the value of the numerator. Okay? And that'll be true for all three of these components. Now, this particular equation is actually known as the IS curve. Notice that when we did this, we said that actual expenditures equals planned expenditures. So we are in equilibrium. Notice we also have a relationship between economic output and the real interest rate. And that relationship is an inverse one. Now, why do we call this the IS curve? As I mentioned earlier, it's called the IS curve because in a closed economy, investment equals savings. Right? Investment equals savings. So a couple things to remember. It's the inverse relationship between output and the real interest rate, but only when the market is in equilibrium. So it depends upon all those variables that we just saw, right? So these first three, autonomous expenditures, autonomous taxes, and autonomous financial frictions, were all in our first component. Our second component was the real interest rate, and our third component, the real exchange rate, and our third component was the real interest rate. So if we want to diagram the IS curve, we'll put the real interest rate on the vertical axis and economic output on the horizontal axis. The IS curve, then, will be a downward sloping relationship, an inverse relationship. Now, keep in mind, every single point on the IS curve is in equilibrium. So what the IS curve tells us is all the combinations of the real interest rate and economic output that give us equilibrium in the market for goods and services. All the combinations of real economic output and the real interest rate that give us equilibrium in the market for goods and services. So notice then that if the interest rate is really high, economic output is going to be relatively low. But we're in equilibrium at point A. Now let's think about something happens and economic output goes up to Y1. Now if you remember your saving and investment diagrams, if income rises, saving would increase. Right? Desired savings function would shift to the right. What would happen to the real interest rate? It will go down. So R1 will also fall. And point B is also in equilibrium. It is possible, we're not going to do it in class, but it's possible to derive the IS curve straight from our saving and investment diagram that we had before. Start with saving and investment, change income, which will change saving, find out what happens to the real interest rate in equilibrium, and plot those points, and you'll get something that looks like this IS curve.